and Sustainable Cities. Before starting with today's program, on behalf of the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Inclusive Cities Center, I would like to first express gratitude to all our dignified guests, esteemed panelists, our colleagues from NIUA, and all the participants for taking the time out of your busy schedules and joining us today. Before we jump right into it, I would go through some quick housekeeping points. The discussion is designed in a way where only the panelists and the moderator are allowed to engage in a conversation. The attendees may please put their cameras, comments, suggestions, or questions in the chat box. The platform has an expected delay of around 10 seconds, so some attendees, depending on the internet connection, may experience some delay in receiving the audio and video. The event is accessible and inclusive. We have Manisha and Atul with us to support with live sign language translation of the discussion. Thank you, Manisha and Atul, for joining us. For them to be able to interpret, we request all the participating panelists to speak at a steady pace. Captions are also available for the event, although there might be accuracy concerns. We will highlight major discrepancies in the chat box, and corrected transcripts will also be available on request post the event. For everyone's kind information, this event is being recorded and a video of the same will be uploaded on NIUA's YouTube channel. We encourage you to pen down your thoughts, and you may share your comments or suggestions post the event on NIUA's social media handles or write to us at icc@niua.org. To get the ball rolling, I would now like to request my colleague, Ms. Kanika Bansal, Senior Program Associate NIUA, to give the welcome address for today's session.
Thank you, Shivangi. Greetings, everyone. It is my honor and privilege to welcome our dignified guest, Sri Hitesh Vaidya, Director NIUA, and our panelist, Ms. Neha Sachdeva Zomato, Ms. Shalini Sinha from Vigo, Ms. Pratima Joshi from Shelter Associate, Ms. Anna Claudia Rosbeck, expert from Brazil, Dr. Pvm Rao from IIT Delhi, Mr. Chapal Khasnabis from WHO, and Mr. Daniel Hajaz from GDI Hub London. We are delighted to have such eminent panelists joining us from the length and breadth of the globe. It is my pleasure to welcome all the participants and colleagues to this international webinar on building inclusive digital infrastructure for resilient and sustainable cities. Inclusion is the process of improving the terms on which individuals and groups take part in the society, which focuses on improving their ability, opportunity, and dignity of those disadvantaged based on their identity. As perfectly summarized by the thought leader Andres T. Tapia in his famous quote, "Diversity is the mix and inclusion is making the mix work." Putting people at the center of development and protecting lives and livelihood lies at the core of our institutional mandate and has been integrated as a cross-cutting component across different projects. To strengthen the vertical and horizontal integration of inclusion and adopt a 360-degree approach, inclusion was institutionalized at NIUA through the formulation of the Inclusive Cities Center, ICC, in strategic partnership with GIZ India. Just a year ago, the Inclusive Cities Center strategy document was launched with a big bang. As we are commemorating the first anniversary of Inclusive Cities Center, we have the launch of the first ICC magazine, along with launch of a compendium of best practices for heritage conservation. The center is leading this vision of inclusion across different facets of city development under the able leadership of Mr. Ajay Suri. Through its ongoing program, including building accessible, safe, inclusive Indian cities, BASIC, infant, toddler, and caregiver neighborhood ITCN, and shaping youth future, the center has been actively contributing to make urban India inclusive for persons with disability, children, and youth. The recent pandemic has further reinforced the presence of digital technology in every facet of urban life. While it acts as an enabler in many ways, it could also act as a barrier, particularly for marginalized socioeconomic groups. Though the webinar Through the webinar today, we aim to look at digital inclusion from various lenses, discuss both local and global perspectives, and appraise the best practices, explore innovative solutions for the way forward. We will have 3 sessions with presentations from speakers, both internationally and nationally, and each with an open Q&A session. We are glad to have a set of people who have worked on this issue at the local, national, and global scale. It is indeed a diverse yet perfect mix of panelists to deliberate on today's discussion. Not taking any further time, I again welcome our Director Sir, our guests, panelists, and participants to today's webinar. Over to you, Shivangi.
Thank you, Kanika, for the brief and to set the pace right. Duke Ellington said, "My attitude is to never be satisfied, never enough, never." The quote very well reflects our Director Sir, Mr. Hitesh Vaidya, who always envisions integrating inclusion in every aspect of urban development. Sir, may I request you to please deliver the opening address and share your thoughts on the role of digital technologies in building inclusive cities for the future. Mr. Hitesh Vaidya brings in more than 25 years of experience in urban development, project formulation, implementation, and program management in reputed organizations such as the United Nations, World Bank, and the US Agency for International Development, USAID, among others.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak here. Before I start speaking, I want to personally congratulate Pratima Joshi from Shelter Associates for getting that recognition at the national level for her work, which she has done for the low-income settlements of Pune and all over Maharashtra. So congratulations, Pratima. I personally feel proud. I personally feel proud to be associated with you. Thank you. And I think, if I really recall my journey or my thinking to inclusiveness started with associating with you. So thank you guiding us for all this time and making sure those principles which you have laid for us, I have tried to bring them in the work of day-to-day work of NIUA. So thanks. Thanks all the panelists who have joined. All the participants who have joined from different parts of the globe. Congratulations for having this international thinking about inclusive digital infrastructure for resilient and sustainable cities. And thank you for coming on this platform to share your ideas, your thoughts, your best practices with us. And, I just want to describe National Institute of Urban Affairs. Our major focus is basically to support cities or nudge states and cities towards this idea of inclusiveness in this thing. As an NIUA being a think tank of Government of India, our focus is how do we provide not knowledge, but only tools, templates, standards, training, capacity building, technologies, and transfer of knowledge from the global to the local. And that's the journey which we have been taking for last several years. The focus now has been much more onto an action-oriented work and local actions rather than just frameworks and templates. So that's where we are. And I think all the people who are in the panel have actually soiled their hands and bring more actions on the ground and understand the challenges at the local level of, starting these new ideas. My whole thing is, while we talk about cities as engines of economic growth, engine of economic growth will not work unless that is supported by sustainable engine and inclusive engine. And unless we start, so the first point of order is let's start talking cities only as cities of economic growth. I think we need to change that definition. Cities are engines of not only economic growth, but cities are the engines which push sustainability and inclusivity. And their nexus between three has to go together if we really want our people to be happy. End of the result, whether we call it a resilient, sustainable, digital, whatever city we call it, or smart city, it's basically when I open the tap, the water should come out of it. And otherwise, there is nothing calling about inclusion and others. This remains the word. How do I convert these definitions, these languages into the local language. And that's my one thing. While we talk about digital, resilient, sustainable, these have become a more of abusive words than the actually using words. So my question is, do you need the granularity of this resilient journey, sustainable journey, digital journey? It will depend on data, will depend on evidence at the local level. How do we bring this evidence to really start a grammar which is of Indian context, or of Indian case studies, of Indian knowledge products, rather than we just pick up international knowledge and try to imbibe in our culture, because you can change. The words remain the same. I was just talking to a professor from IIT the other day. He says, whether you talk to a World Bank, whether you talk to ADB, whether you talk to global practices, the word will remain accessible, inclusive, sustainable. The word will not change. What changes them is a culture. So how do you imbibe the culture of inclusiveness into the culture with these words? That is what the contextualizes. We, change that into our own DNA. How do we do that? And I think that's where the action we require to do it. Right now, when we say word inclusion, and I'm being as honest, if you tell a commissioner of an urban local body, you have to be inclusive, his first question will be, tell me what I need to do, to become a. So if we can give a menu of actions, not into a big story, but menu of actions. These are the small actions. These are the medium-term actions. These are the long-term actions, which you can start within your own urban local bodies. You will have that journey towards inclusiveness. And digital infrastructure definitely is the starting point of that journey towards inclusiveness. But I think the time has come now to start really coming very, very action ground, work at the ground level and say, these are the 5 actions that need to be done within your tenure. Otherwise, we will not achieve the, what. And I think that, with so many partners here sitting, I think that what is that NIUA is trying to do? Because you have on your own everything. It's like a unscrambled word where you have a different words. You bring different strengths. And NIUA is trying to bring these words together to create a much better word for the thing. So we're creating from letters, we are creating a word. And that is what we want to work with you as a partner, that we create a new words for the inclusiveness for the city. And otherwise, we all have our own strength. We all have our own silos. We all have our own agendas. But how do we bring together that it helps cities? I think that is the focus. And that is the focus this Inclusive City Center of NIUA is trying to bring all your partners, bring all your strengths together so that we can start taking that journey. And I always recall right now our situation, and whether we call it sustainable, we call it 2070 net zero, the big dreams, we are all like Arjuna on the Mahabharata battle, where he is standing and he doesn't know, should he fight? Should he not fight? Should he pick up the arms and start shooting, or should he not pick up the arm or shooting? And there he had a Krishna to give him a knowledge. And I think here you all partners are a Krishna, that we come up with, create that knowledge, create that Gita, create that context to really start talking about, because we are all confused. And only way we can really start this journey is through deliberation, through dialogue, through discussion. And that is what this idea is, because nobody has a single solution. There is no one-size-fits approach here. We need to really come up with different ways of doing it, different principles of doing it. And I look forward to this deliberation today, so that we start coming up what we really need to do if as a city, I'm a commissioner, what guidance, what tools, what assessment I need, or frameworks I need to give it to the commissioner, that he start taking those decisions, because every decision has to have effect on others. So we need to really think about, how do I give a decision when he is in a short tenure in that urban local bodies? He not only make a decision, he implement that decision, and he also starts seeing the impacts of fruits of that decision. And that comfort is a responsibility for academia or a practitioners like us to give it to him. So I really think that I am not what you call expert on digitization and what digitization will do, but I definitely see a huge advantage that digitization is or a digital infrastructure is the one infrastructure which can bring this bridge the gap between the haves and have-nots much better, easier than anywhere else we can do it. So with this short address, I will welcome all the experts and thank you for joining us today. I hope this discussion today will end up in some kind of a menu card or some outcome, which we can then say that these are the couple of actions we can say that cities can start taking to become much more inclusive. So with that, thank you, and over to you, Shivangi.
Thank you, Hitesh sir, for sharing your vision of creating a digital ecosystem and stressing the need for inclusion of all and contextualizing in the system. Moving forward with our agenda today, we have a few launches. First is the ICC magazine, Exclusively Inclusive, which brings forth the larger and more vulnerable part of our cities that often tends to be neglected in the form of discussions, narrations, and illustrations. I would request Mr. Hitesh Vaidya, Director, NIUA, and Mr. Ajay Suri, Senior Advisor, NIUA, and Head of the Inclusive City Center, to please unveil the first ICC magazine. Mr. Suri is an economist and a development expert with a long-standing experience in formulating strategies and managing people-centered development programs in India and Southeast Asia, among others. Dear sirs, I request you to kindly do the honors.
You know, when I'm seeing this on the screen, it has to be exclusive. Inclusive is looking upside down. So I think I have to do it like this to become exclusive, inclusive much easier. So the question is, if you really want to do exclusive, inclusive, you have to turn the dice around. So, you know, it has to be much more stronger. So with that, yes, congratulations.
Thank you, sirs. I also request you both to kindly launch the Compendium of Best Practices in Urban Heritage Management. The Compendium features a compilation of different practices from cities across the globe to preserve cultural heritage in growing urban cities using strategic planning, knowledge, and financial tools. Now presenting a short video capturing a glimpse of the document. Thank you, Director Sir and Mr. Suri.
Historic cities in India and the world over have played an exceptional role in contributing to the knowledge of the development of urban planning and infrastructure in the world. However, we are at a turning point today with the rural-urban transition and the resultant urbanization engulfing small historic settlements and turning the inner cities into low-income housing clusters. Having said that, these still remain the nuclei of all economic activity. UNESCO, a specialized agency of the United Nations, recognized these challenges back in 2005 and started a discourse on area-based heritage management that led to the recommendation of the historic urban landscape approach in 2011. NIUA is glad to launch the Compendium of the Best Practices in Urban Heritage Management with a focus on UNESCO's historic urban landscape approach and how it has been followed in different cities around the world. The document is a compilation of different practices from cities across the globe to preserve the cultural heritage in the growing urban cities using strategic planning, knowledge, and financial tools.
With that, we move towards the more serious but interesting discussions. I would request my colleague, Ms. Veronica Kwekyu-Malu Vijanamai, Learning and Communications Associate Basic Program, to set the context for today's discussions.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Veronica Vijanamai. I am a Learning and Communication Associate at the Inclusive City Center at the NIUA. I'm going to be setting the context for today. Yeah. Today, a special pattern of urbanization indicates a gradual shift from the global north to the global south as the hub of growth and urbanization. In this, India and China is projected to be leading this narrative of urbanization. As we discuss this growth, we see that the internet and e-commerce sector in India is emerging as one of the fastest growing sector in the country and even globally. This growth has been further accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where we use applications and internet for livelihoods, recreation, transport, and many other activities that we can count. In the developing country, innovation is not only associated with economic growth, but also with poverty alleviation, reduction in inequality, and increase in social mobility. With 600 million population, India ranks second in terms of the number of internet users. To complement this, a report by EY indicates that India's consumer digital economy is expected to be 800 billion US dollar market in 2030. In the year 2021 itself, this sector witnessed around 370% year-on-year growth. This much was how innovation and the digital economy has been growing. But however, in juxtaposition, half of its population lacks access to internet, and only a small percent of 20% has knowledge of digital services in India. These discrepancies on who is part of this digital wave and who is not, I mean, one of the most evident example of this is the mass exodus of people from cities to the rural hinterland as their livelihood options got cut off on the onset of the pandemic. Reports have suggested that 75% of who lost a job during the COVID-19 pandemic were the informal sector. Often falling in line of this marginality is persons with disability with compounded accessibility issues in terms of access to resources and access to user interfaces. Next slide, please. Therefore, today we will be discussing about people in the informal settlement, informal workers and persons with disability, people with transient disabilities, and the elderly whose access to the, digital tools and techniques are often limited by lack of resources and inaccessibility of these platforms and tools. Next slide, please. Yeah, in India, it is seen that around 90% of workers are informal workers, where 52% of registered workers are female and 47 male, indicating a gender disparity even within the informal sector workers, with a long-standing issue of lack in standardization of pay gap, and security, where workers in the informal economy are not recognized, registered, regulated, or protected under labor legislation. Workers often face issues of access to information, market finance, training, and technology. Along with this, as the businesses of the informal economy are not often regulated, the incomes and expenses are often omitted from the regulatory framework, leaving a major chunk of the economy out of the tax net. This lack of data also hinders from a dedicated policy framework being formulated for the informal sector workers or accessing economic resources ranging from property to financial to other business services. Yeah. So predominantly constituting of migrants and low-wage informal sector workers, the informal settlement has its own set of challenges. Increasing urbanization has led to resource crunch, where cities are witnessing huge lack in infrastructural capacities to support the burgeoning urban population. As per the UN, the slum population worldwide that had declined from 2000 to 2014 is seeing a reverse effect, where recent data shows that there is again a reversal of there is an increase in the slum population. This has escalated to cities not being able to prioritize slum redevelopment projects, where urbanization and population growth are outpacing the construction of new affordable homes, and to mention about accessible home as well. Often a time in this, slums are perceived to be temporary, and as a result, there is low incentive to invest in slum, prohibiting from slum upgrading project to happen, along with a lack of basic facilities and inaccessible sites and mobility. Informal settlers are also exposed to increased health risk, disability. Example is the COVID-19 pandemic, where people found it very difficult, where stakeholders found it difficult to observe social distancing within these informal settlement colonies. Further along, studies assessing 376 other studies on diseases also shows that diseases like cough and diarrheal diseases and intellectual disability had a strong correlation with slum dwellers. So as we see this, there are increasing number of challenges even in the informal settlement. So in the next slide, please. So when it comes to accessible ICTs and ATs, like I've said earlier, falling in this line of marginality along with informal sector workers are also persons with disability and also elderly who are often left out of this digitization process. The World Health Organization estimates that 15% of the world total population has some form of disability. But when it comes to, when we're talking about digital inclusion and the increase of innovation and digitization, there is often a lack of discussion in the area of accessible ICTs and ATs, where there is a reluctance in the adoption of ATs because of so many reasons, because of perceptional issues, because of affordability issues, and also because of lack of advocacy. As you can see, there is also a lack of skill and training to use these accessible ATs and ICTs. This can be translated also into the lack of incentivization of startups in investing in designing affordable ATs and ICTs, and often at times these ATs and ICTs are often limited to the idea of mainstream accessible technologies such as wheelchair or white canes. Therefore, there is a need for a deeper penetration of accessible technologies when we talk about growth and when we talk about growth in general in cities. Therefore, reiterating again the fact, once again recalling the fact about the how the India is expected to grow to a 800 billion market economy in 2030. This gainful contribution to the GDP will only be possible with the integration of persons with disability, the informal sector workers, the people from the informal settlement. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation with 3 key questions for the panelists and the discussion that follows after this. How do we bridge the digital divide for integration of informal sector in the city value chain? How do we use ODPs to help integrate informal settlement and city development? And what are the ways to address inclusion of persons with disability, including persons with transient disability and elderly, through accessible ICTs and ATs? Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. You have very well set the spirit for the day. I would now hand over the strings of the webinar, or to simply put it, the moderation, to Mr. Utsav Chaudhary. He is the team lead of the Building Accessible, Safe and Inclusive Indian Cities project at NIUA.
Thank you, Shivangi. Much appreciated. And thank you, Veronica, for setting the stage so beautifully for us speakers. I think those questions were pertinent and the focus is right there where we want it to be. But before I proceed any further, a quick update for all of our attendees who have joined in today. The magazine and the compendium that were recently launched by our director, Mrs. Suri, are now available for download in the chat box. So they are in PDF format, so please feel free to quickly go ahead and download them. That being said, once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone here today. Thank you so very much for taking the time out. I really appreciate it. Shivangi, thank you for the introduction. My name is Utsav, and I lead the work on disability inclusion at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. A key focal point within the larger narrative of building inclusive cities has been this tireless effort to talk about the marginalized groups, something that my colleague Veronica talked about, and for them to be mainstreamed into three essential aspects of urban living: planning, design, and implementation. And something that the Inclusive City Center has been working towards, which is why I feel we are extremely humbled and grateful to have the good fortune to be among some of the best minds in the business who have been working tirelessly towards this topic. And for me to be in a position to be moderating a discussion among them. That being said, the panel session today pivots on the three key questions that Veronica displayed, and our experts will be presenting around it. The format of the discussion would involve a case study presentation for about 10 minutes for each of our panelists, post which we'll be engaging with them in an open session with questions from the attendees, which will be about 10 minutes again. But before we jump right into it, let me take a moment to introduce all of our fellow panelists. And while I do so, may I request them to kindly switch on their cameras, please, so that the attendees can see who they are. So in order of the presentation, we are joined today by Ms. Neha Sachdeva from Zomato. Neha Sachdeva is the Assistant Vice President Online Ordering at Zomato. As part of the central strategy team, she looks after the growth of restaurants and food outlets. She has been with Zomato for more than 6 years now. Thank you so much for joining us, Neha. It's a pleasure having you here. Next up, we have Ms. Shalini Sinha from Vigo. She is the Focal City Delhi Coordinator. And Vigo stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. Her work focuses on developing and documenting decent work and livelihood opportunities for women workers in informal economy, and has worked on issues related to home-based workers for many years now. Currently, she is developing a Focal Cities program for Delhi, which includes supporting member-based organizations of women informal workers in the capacity building and advocacy efforts at the city level. Shalini, thank you so much for joining us and welcome again. Next up, we have Ms. Pratima Joshi. I think much has been talked about her recent accomplishments, but just a quick introduction about her. She is a founding executive director of Shelter Associates and founded it in 1993 and has been working since then towards empowering of communities living in informal settlements to pursue their right to dignity and a better quality of life. Pratima is the only Indian to receive the Google Earth Hero Award and is identified by BBC as a leading slum architect of India. Pratima has been honored by Forbes as one of the most powerful women in India in their W Power list of 2001 for innovative use of plus codes for delivering essential services to unreachable communities. Pratima ji, your work is inspiring, as was mentioned by the director, and we all take inspiration from it. So thank you so much for joining us. Next up, we have Ms. Ana Claudia Rosbach, expert and advisor in housing and urban policies for organizations from Global South in Brazil. Ana is the founder and director of an NGO that develop high impact projects in communities in Brazil. She's also working as an expert and consultant to several international organizations and is highly committed to maximizing global practices to overcome urban poverty. Previously, she has worked as a senior housing specialist for the World Bank in Brazil and internationally, and has provided technical assistance for the development and implementation of Brazilian housing and slum upgrading policy as a high-level consultant, including 2 major programs by the name of PAC Favelas and the Housing Subsidies Program. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Next up, we have Dr. Pvm Rao from IIT Delhi. He's a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Design. He's also a co-founder of Assistive Lab that works towards the development of assistive technologies for the empowerment of the visually challenged. His current teaching and research interests include product design and manufacturing, with a special emphasis on the design of medical and assistive devices. He has several patents and design registrations to his credit, many of which have been commercialized. Dr. Rao, it's a pleasure having you with us. Next up, we have Dr. Chabul Khasnabis from WHO. Dr. Khasnabis is a social and technical innovator who spent most of his career in the field of prosthetics and orthotics, assistive technology and rehabilitation, especially community-based rehabilitation, working in the underprivileged communities. He's currently working in the Public Health and Innovation team under the Department of Essential Medicines and Health Products and leads the WHO's new initiative, global initiative of global cooperation on assistive technology, also called by the name of GATE, to improve access to accessible health technologies for persons with disability, older people, and others in need. Dr. Khasnabis, thank you so much for joining us. Last up, we have Dr. Daniel Hajaz. He's the Innovation Manager at GDI Hub. Dr. Hajaz joined the GDI Hub and UCL Interaction Center in the role of Innovation Manager in November of 2021. He has researched topics in the intersection of human-computer interaction, science communication, and haptics under the supervision of Professor Mariana Obstris at the Sussex Human-Computer Interaction Lab. At GDI Hub, in his role as Innovation Manager, he is working on accelerating innovation projects through various network processes, building new partnerships, and extending GDI Hub's portfolio. Thank you, Dr. Hajaz, for joining us. That's all for our panelists today, and thank you once again for all those who are here today. So without further ado, I will cue in Neha for her presentation and to start the first session of the day, which is Bridging the Digital Divide for Integration of Informal Sector into the City Value Chain. Neha, over to you.
Thank you so much for the detailed introduction itself. Glad to be sharing this platform with all the panelists and all the participants over here. Thank you for having me here, the entire NIUA team. Today, I'm going to specifically focus my discussions on how internet is empowering, how's internet access to technology and internet empowering our informal sector, especially in the smaller cities. So without wasting too much time, I would jump into my presentation. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Like we all know, Zomato is a platform restaurant aggregator who helps restaurant partners in delivering the food to the customers. Zomato right now has three major stakeholders: customers, delivery partners, and the restaurant partners. This is how the entire ecosystem of restaurant business works, which is you go ahead and take orders from the customers, give it to the delivery partners. Now, Zomato is more inclined to giving better services. The more better services that you give to the customers, they will go ahead and place more orders, which in return comes to the delivery partners, which means you need more delivery partners to deliver your order. Delivery partners will have more orders to deliver, which then in turn sort of increases their earnings. They can go ahead and earn more from what they were earning earlier. These orders reach to the customers, and then the cycle of having more restaurants on the platform gives more choices to the users, gives more affordability to users, which in turn again helps the customer to place more orders. And hence this is how the supply and the demand functions together. Right now, Zomato is available in 1,000+ cities, which is a combination of bigger cities, smaller cities, and the towns, where Zomato as a platform, people can use Zomato as a platform to sort of place an order. We can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So coming to the specific topic, back in February 2021, we initiated a project with the MOHUA team, which is Ministry of Housing and Affairs team, which was named as PM Swanidhi scheme, under which the objective of this project was to go ahead and onboard the street vendors, basically coming in from the informal sectors, and help them deliver the orders, unlock the sustainable livelihood for these partners by empowering them with the digital, by leveraging the digital technology. So under this, we started this onboarding, wherein we started training these vendors, bringing them on board. We started finding these vendors. We got the data from MOHUA team. We started visiting these vendors, and then started talking about how this will go ahead and change their livelihood, or how can they go ahead and make their livelihood sustainable. as soon as we started this, we saw a wave, the pandemic coming in, which in turn then started hitting these restaurant partners, the entire restaurant industry, in a very negative way. People stopped ordering. And that is the time these digitization and the technology came as a savior to a lot of restaurant partners who otherwise would not have gotten these business. We can go to the next slide, please. So right now we have some 1,000 plus street vendors onboarded on a platform in roughly 64 cities. Now, when we talk about digitization, giving them more technology, leveraging more technology, we also need to understand the audience that we are talking about. So the approach that we used over here was, how can we make their onboarding process much and more simpler so that they can go ahead and much of technology. So ease of onboarding was the focus area for us. We figured out the easiest way to sort of go ahead and approach them, have them on our platform. Then how do we sort of go ahead and train them? So we created entire training materials, which was again very easy to use. We had our on-ground team who were literally going and helping and talking to these vendors, making them understand the step-by-step process, which again was a very small step process, but the challenge was to go ahead and talk to them, make them understand. So that was something that the focus was. And then what we saw was that people in the smaller cities, people who have not done that, they sort of started reacting very positively. So they had will to grow. They wanted to grow. This was a platform that was being given to them, and hence they started coming on the platform. Now, we also sort of made sure that they have the right set of documents to come on board, which is, we want them to make sure that once we are onboarding them, they're also following the guidelines and the protocols that we have to follow in the food and business industry, which is making sure that all of them have the FSI license in place, which is the must-have. So in case they did not have that, we helped them created that license, which also made sure that now they're a registered vendor, right? And moving from informal sector to a formal sector. So this is all was done to sort of go ahead and bring them on board. Now, if you can just go to the next slide, please. Now, how does this benefit them? So this sort of opportunity on coming on the app and taking orders on the app, this gives an opportunity to them to serve new customers. Imagine a street vendor who's standing on the road and there are people who are coming in to place an order from him. Most of the time, you will see a street vendor will be able to cover some certain radius. Maybe people who are living nearby within 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers will visit that place and order food. So by having them or by using this technology and leveraging this technology, there are a lot of people who would now order for their convenience sitting at their home, which means that you're giving them opportunity to sort of increase their wider radius. The entire city or probably a customer who's sitting at some 5 to 7 kilometers or 8 kilometers radius can now also go ahead and place an order from the same place. The other thing is that it also brings in a lot of trust between the customers. So a customer who wants to make sure that he eats the hygiene food. Now there's some sort of, the customer understands, the user understands that this particular person has taken a FSI license, which means he's following the basic hygiene guidelines, which gives us confidence to that customer to place an order. Now, the existing customers, because you've created so much of convenience from them, they will also go ahead and order more. Probably somebody who was eating a street food from these vendors once a month or once a week. Now, because the convenience is available, there are more choices available for the users, they end up ordering more, which in turn creates more business for these partners. So that's like, that is how they go ahead and get more business. We can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So like I said, that we have some 1,000+ vendors who have been doing great business on the platform. They have sort of many folds their business that they used to get earlier. They have all now sort of adapted to the technology. They know how to use the app. They know how to place an order. They know how to sort of go ahead and turn themselves off when they're not ready to take an order. They know what are the timings they are going to be available at one address. How do they create their menus? So all of these, with all of these trainings, we believe that we have been able to sort of create some sort of impact in the livelihoods of these people. And we continue to do more. We aim to do more. Now, what can be better than just reading out what certain partners have to say about coming on the platform. So this is a real testimonial that we've received from one of the partners. I would just read it for you, and I feel very glad when I read this, which is Zomato के आने से ये हुआ कि अब कोई भी आप ऐप खोल के मुझे ढूंढ सकता है, which means now with the help of Zomato, now anybody can come on to my platform, come and search me in the city. लॉकडाउन के समय जब कस्टमर स्टॉल पे नहीं आते थे, तब जोमेटो की वजह से अपने कस्टमर से जुड़े रहने और अपना स्टॉल को चालू रखने में काफी मदद मिली. Which means that in the time of pandemic, when nobody was visiting me, just because of Zomato, there were a lot of people who were ordering in from me by sitting at their home, and I was able to run my business. और साथ साथ मेरे जायके मेरे शहर में सब तक पहुंचने लगा, which means that now a lot of people know me, a lot of people sort of now know my taste, and they can anytime order from me. With the introduction of Zomato, the benefit was that anybody could find me on the app. During the pandemic, customers who could not come to the stall would order from the app. It further helped me in reaching new customers across the city. Can we move to the next slide, please? There's another testimonial which talks about, I've been running my stall for 12 years now. My poha is popular, but with Zomato's help, I could make nearly 6,000 rupees more on a weekly basis. Now, this is a vendor which is in a city called Bhopal who serves poha by the name of Roop Singh. So just to conclude my presentation, what I'm trying to tell you over here is that, or what my thoughts are, that with the a lot of these people these days carry a smartphone, a basic smartphone, and a basic internet connection. That is all that they need to sort of go ahead and leverage the technology. With this, they're going ahead and sort of creating their wider base for the user. We are making sure that they're licensed, they're registered, and creating a sustainable livelihood for them, may it be the restaurant partners or may it be the delivery partners. I think this is what I wanted to talk about. Happy to hear if there are more questions.
Thank you, Neha, for adhering to the time. Neha, what we'll do is we'll quickly go on to the next presentation from Shalini ji, and then we will take the questions at the end.
Sure.
So Shalini ji, can I just invite you for your presentation, please? Miss Shalini Sinha, yeah. Yes, we can see you now. I think you're on mute.
I'd like somebody to start my presentation.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, so thank you to the organizers, thank you to NIUA and for giving me this opportunity, and also thank you to people who are participating in this webinar. I work with an organization, as was presented in my introduction, called WeGo. We are an international network, a global network which works towards empowering the working poor, especially women in informal employment. Is there a problem with my PowerPoint?
Just a moment, Shalini ji.
Ji.
Apologies, we're just trying to figure it out. While we are at it, Shalini ji, I mean, why don't you start with your presentation and we'll cue you in.
Yeah. So I'll do that. So basically, informal employment, as we understand it, and workers in the informal employment are workers who do not have employment-based social protection, and enterprises which are not incorporated or registered. So it's a combination of both which constitutes informal employment. Before me, in the opening presentation by the esteemed director of NIUA, he mentioned that cities are engines which push sustainability and inclusivity. And it is, I want to also add to it that it is these informal workers, many of them whose contribution to cities' economies and to the running of the city is very crucial. Estimates about informally employed, how many workers are informally employed globally. 61% of all workers are informally employed. This is ILO data. In India, over 90% are informally employed. Delhi, the city of Delhi, 80% of male workers are informally employed and 82% of women workers are informally employed. Informal employment means low wages, poor earnings, low productivity, and of course, as I said, the absence of social protection. We cannot talk about informal employment without putting it in the context of the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the loss of income that pandemic has brought for these set of workers. We have done a study, which is a longitudinal study of 11 cities in the world, where we've looked at the impact of COVID in two periods of time. And I will not go into the details of the study. I just want to point out two things: that even today, the earnings are still, for many sectors and many workers, the earnings are below the pre-pandemic levels. And the average number of days work per week was also considerably lower than the pre-pandemic period. The third thing that we see is that, informal economy is not a universal monolith, but consists of different sectors. Street vendors we heard about, but also waste pickers, home-based workers, domestic workers, and the impact of the COVID has been segmented, has been varied across sectors, and therefore the recovery has also been. But the important point that I want to make, next slide, please, is about COVID relief, and it has some learnings for us going forward vis-a-vis building inclusive digital infrastructure for our cities. Is many workers received income support thanks to the digital tools. However, there were some barriers that were identified, and our study showed that the main barriers in accessing cash grant, whether it is cash grant, food relief, or loans to restart business, across various cities of the globe, was often related to complex online application process, being unaware of the relief measures, and lack of documentation. For example, if we look at Durban and Delhi, and we take cash grants, we realize that a lot of workers reported that there was lack of proper documentation. They did not have the proper documentation to avail of these benefits. I also want to highlight to you that the Prime Minister's Street Vendors Atmanirbhar Swanidhi scheme, which is a scheme for street vendors. It's a scheme for microcredit. It's a microcredit facility started during pandemic, very helpful to the street vendors. It involved a collateral-free loan with low rates of interest for the street vendors. However, in our study of how the street vendors have been able to access it, we realized that there was a complicated application process for vendors, particularly because the recognition of vendors in the city of Delhi, I'm speaking in the context of Delhi, where they were not recognized or legal, because the survey of the street vendors, which is part of the Street Vendors Act, had not been completed, and therefore that was a major hurdle. So while this scheme was organized, the registration of the street vendors, their identity, a legal identity, had not been established. So in response to the workers' street vendors movement, what happened was that the process was expanded to allow for other forms of proxy identification, an excellent move. However, ironically, one of them was a recommendation letter from the ULB. Now, getting this, so what it needed was that you get a physical letter for an online application for accessing the scheme. And there, of course, it had its own challenges of getting those kind of physical letter. Next, please. So I was just giving you some examples of in the recent past, putting it in the context of growing urbanization, large informal sector, cities, giving you examples of cities and access to benefits in the past few years, which have taught us some lessons. So first of all, what we see as emerging trends is there's also digital transformation of labor market, introducing new forms of informality, the gig economy, the platformization of some of these services, particularly to take the example of household services, on-demand household services, which come to us through platforms. Though they said that's one form of development that has happened in the past few years, but also there's an increasing trend to apply digital tools in policy design and implementation for accelerating the transition to formality. So while we are talking about informal movement from informal, insecure to formal, more secure, more protected livelihood, the question we are asking is, can the digital technology improve working conditions and help workers and small informal enterprises transition to formal working arrangements? Next slide, please. I want to take this, before we address some of these questions, I want to also take the example of e-Shram. Now, in 2021, the Union Minister of Labour and Employment, the Government of India, launched an initiative to form the National Database of Informal Workers. This was channeled through the e-Shram web portal with the aim of registering an estimated 38 crores workers in the Indian informal economy, truly a mammoth task, and much has been achieved under it. What did this registration entail? It entailed that it was a process which was entirely web-based and through e-Shram website or mobile application. It collects data of the worker's name, occupation, address, education, etc. And to enroll into this, the worker had to mandatorily it requires a mobile number and which is linked to the Aadhaar card, which is for the global audience, the unique identification number issued by the Government of India, as well as details of a bank account. So it needed these kind of processes in place before you could register. Once you were able to register, the workers issued an e-Shram card, which is registered as a worker, recognition as a worker, and a universal account number, a UAN.
Shalini, just a quick update on the time. You have 1.5 minutes left.
Oh, so just to say that in the initial days, some of the challenges we faced was not just only about awareness, but also there was problems around registration. The digital mode was not accessible to workers, especially women who may not have a smartphone, who may not have the digital knowledge to enroll. The mandatory requirements of mobile-linked Aadhaar details, these were big challenges. And several of the women, invisible sectors of women, where women dominated, such as home-based work, was not included. Next slide, please. So while we are moving forward and going into this, I want to say that to me and to what I understand to formalizing, it's not just flipping a switch. It is not even a registration. It is not also issuing a license. Formalizing means more protected and augmented livelihood with better income, better protection, and which is designed in consultation both with the workers and the businesses. And this can be managed and by a policy of digital transformation, provided it is managed and guided towards pro-poor and inclusive income for informal workers. The second thing is that there is, as I mentioned to you, there's digital metamorphosis of social protection. And of course, started before COVID, but COVID has accelerated, and there are lots of learnings there. So first of all, we say that designing inclusion in the social protection and public goods provision on favorable terms, which means that no doubt they are efficient systems, but they also have to build in systems of access and inclusion. Often workers get excluded. They have problems of accessibility of digital knowledge, digital access, and the cost of being included is borne entirely by the worker. The second thing is that inclusion in digital commerce has opened up many opportunities, but these opportunities have to be designed from the worker perspective with equity, democratic, and regulated processes in place. Digital literacy and access to affordable connectivity are the two pillars on which a movement like this will need to be designed, and the labor laws cannot move away as we go into new forms of employment relationships through gig economy or platform economy. Finally, I want to say that more research study needs to be done as these processes take shape about impact, access, gender, marginalization, sectors which are able to integrate easily, and sectors which get left behind. In my final presentation, I want to leave you with this vision. Next slide, please. This vision of this woman who's working all alone in a little home in a slum in the outskirts of Delhi. And if we are going to create a city which is resilient and sustainable, and which has been inclusive digital infrastructure, then it is this woman who's invisible, who does not have voice, who does not have literacy, who does not have access to digital data, and finds it difficult to buy it, does not even have the funds to buy it. I think it is this last person in the connectivity change who will need to be included as we go ahead in designing resilient and sustainable cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini ji. Thank you for the really beautiful presentation. I think you have touched upon some really pressing questions around how do you sort of connect the individuals and how do you leverage the power of technology to bring them to the mainstream. So I think we have used up some of our time for the open discussion, so I'll keep it brief. I do have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start with Neha, if that's okay with you, Shalini ji. Sure. So Neha, the first question that I have for you, and maybe I'll just limit it to one question for now, is since you have seen the COVID has sort of pushed everyone to the digital economy, we are using platforms more than ever before. Do you think the increasing number of users for online products and services over time, and especially during COVID, has sort of streamlined this demand and supply chain in some sense? And has it also sort of led to an improvement in quality and product services over time? If so, if we just sort of briefly touch upon it.
Sure. So of course that has, because business nowadays are able to at least reach to larger set of customers, capture wider areas, new markets because of internet and technology and digitization, which in turn also creates enough convenience for the customers, thereby again increasing the demand. We saw that demand and supply graph like I discussed in my presentation. So considering this, all of this is now creating enough competition in the market, which means the supply side has to keep on increasing the quality standard. That's the only way for them to survive in the market. With such a wide availability of assortments and affordability for the users, customers are now going to choose the best out of it, which means you'll have to keep on upgrading the quality and keep on bridging the gap of supply and the demand that we have.
Thank you, Neha. Just to sort of come back on the point of improved quality services, I mean, have you visibly seen that happen? Let's say you had some anecdotes and testimonials from some of your partners. Have you seen that happening across all platforms, not just limited to food delivery? Do you see that happening in other platforms as well, where some sense of informality existed before?
So of course, like if I'm an end user as well, right? So if I go ahead and compare the convenience that I used to get earlier, that's multifold now. Which also, like if I talk about any platform, whether it's an e-commerce platform, whether it's wherein I'm not just talking about food. Imagine me as a user, like I now have multiple options to order from. I have better pricing, which means that every vendor who was supplying me the good to better quality has now sort of go ahead to make sure that the quality is the best for me as a user to choose that, right?
Yeah.
So that of course that is not very limited to food industry, but applies to every e-commerce industry that we're talking about and every online business that we're talking about.
Thank you, Neha. Neha, what I'll do is I'll quickly sort of take your response and maybe park it with Shalini ji for her consideration. Shalini ji, you see the potential of the digital platforms opening up so many avenues for so many people, and that has been the case, as Neha has clearly shown her in her presentation as well. Do you think that the gig economy at large, which is currently in place, has some sense of informality to it? Is a viable solution to integrate the informal workers into the formal economy? And if so, do you think what kind of social safety nets are required to ensure that the quality of workforce is up to it?
Well, you've taken the words out of my mouth. I think integration just does not mean augmenting income. It also means looking at risks. It also means plugging those risks. It also needs social protection. And the other question is that in this market economy, how is the informal worker, the poor, informal, disenfranchised informal worker, how are they operating, and who bears the cost of their involvement into this this kind of an economy? I think those things cannot be ignored as we go forward. So currently the situation as it exists, I think there is a lot that we can do for creating a level playing field, whereas, a small street vendor is not pitched against say Haldiram, who's also selling chole bhature, and he's also selling chole bhature. And therefore, what can we do to create level playing field, and which may have to go much beyond the opportunities to sell or opportunities to better the livelihood, but it needs a host of services which provide protected, secure work life for those in the informal sector. Then only can we say that these platforms can create a facilitating environment for formalizing of the informal workers. Gender is a very important aspect. So even as we create this, we have to keep a watch on whether women workers who are, they are segmented into sectors which are highly invisible, which are very poorly paid, which are very insecure with no agency. So often a process of digitization, and we've heard all these stories. All of us know that no smartphone, limited access to phones, shared with the family, etc. So what does that imply for a woman worker? I think some of these questions we are asking as we move towards new formulas for integration, for building resilient cities, for integrating informal workers into building these cities through digital platforms. We cannot do it without asking these questions.
Well said, Shalini. Thank you, Neha, and thank you, Shalini, for your remarks and for your impressive presentations. Without taking further any more time from our next presenter, can I just quickly sort of call upon Pratima ji to make her presentation, please?
Hello. I would like to thank Hitesh and Ajay for giving me this opportunity. And I'll jump straight into the presentation. But before that, I just want to say that we've had over 2 decades of working with data, leveraging technology, which has given us, an immense, breadth of the problem, both bird's eye view and worm's eye view, which has helped us make, impactful decisions and do projects on the ground, with stakeholders like the community and the government, and address some of the issues, especially pertaining to service delivery, which are very critical because of a very data-driven approach. So I would just like to start by showing a few slides, which will indicate the way we have leveraged data in our work, where we have worked very closely with communities as well as the government to deliver very critical services like water, sanitation, housing. And I believe that if you have good granular data sets, you can literally, data can be a common platform across all sectors of the government, all departments of the government, which can sort of bring them together, and it can be a game changer. So can we just move to the next slide? Next slide, please. So when I say we've been using a lot of data and a data-driven approach, I want to say that the data was co-created. We created it with both the communities as well as the government. And that's why the quality of data that we had was very reliable. It brought in a lot of confidence, comfort, and clarity in processes. And it was very exciting because I remember 20 years ago when we did our first data and we engaged with the community, we trained them, from paper-based surveys. We have moved on now today to Android-based surveys, and the youth in slums have been very, very enthusiastic about learning technology, using it. So our work has been, in the urban context. We only have worked in slums, and our geographical area of work has been Maharashtra. And we've been working in about 7 cities of Maharashtra, which, right from a small one like Sangli, Miraj, Kupwad, which has barely 5 lakh population, to million plus cities like Pune and Thane. And this approach has been very successful across all sizes and populations, of these cities, and worked very well. So when we worked with the community, we've trained them to gather data, but we've also helped them to understand how this data can be used in their own context, to sort of enhance the quality of living in their slums. So just like we've sort of co-created data with the communities, we've also, can you go to the next slide, please? We've also worked with the urban local bodies and made sure that they validated our data, because unless they feel confidence in using this data, they will never leverage it. So we've had, right from municipal commissioners to the sanitary inspectors, wherever possible, we have worked with them, trained them. They've actually come on the ground, looked at the infrastructure maps that we've created, given their inputs, corrected them, stamped them to say, yes, this is fine, and actually gone a step ahead. And in all the cities that we've worked where we've created data, the cities have linked their website to our website, which is proof that they believed in that data. And not just believed, but they also leveraged it. And I would like to just show a few examples of how this data has been leveraged. Can we go to the next slide? We did a lot of work in sanitation through our one home, one toilet model, since 2013, where it really got an impetus because of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan being launched in 2014. So we started mapping infrastructure. We started creating, accurate maps of slums, every house, doing rapid household surveys, just to understand what was the status of infrastructure in slum and what was the status of infrastructure within each household. Did they have a toilet? Did they have water? Did they have electricity? And were they aspirational about having a home toilet? And while we were collecting all this data, we were also looking at the existing infrastructure. For instance, there are community toilet blocks which are there almost in every slum across the country. But most of them are very stressed out. And in very large settlements, you have more than a couple of CTBs. And the pressure on them can be varying. So we've actually mapped family usage to the community toilet to understand what kind of pressures are there on each of these CTBs, and if there was a way in which that could be redistributed by tackling issues related to the community toilet blocks. Can we go to the next one, please? Then we also started looking at the existing infrastructure. I mean, this is a slum in Pune, which actually had a pretty good network of drainage networks. But what had happened was that some of them were blocked. They needed cleaning out. Some of them were, some of them needed to be replaced. There was a possibility of laying some new drainage lines in places where there weren't lines. So in a way, just tackling these problems on the ground would make the possibility of a home toilet, there for everybody who lived in that settlement. So looking at that infrastructure, we got the urban local bodies to take action and to follow up on what the data was showing. Can we go to the next one, please? And the impact was incredible in quite a few slums. And in some slums where the networks were still not in place. I mean, this is a slum in Navi Mumbai where there was hardly any networks within the slum settlement. We started working in a phased manner. It was easier then for the local body to budget in a very phased manner. So we started out in that slum with with houses which had access to a network. Then in the first year, there was budgetary provisions made for additional drainage networks to be laid. So eventually, within a year and a half or two, we almost covered all the houses. It went up to over 80% that people had a home toilet, and starting from something like 8 or 10%, it was a huge swing. Can we go to the next slide, please? As I said, the validation of the drainage map, we had a seal on every hard copy of the drainage networks that we had, validated on the ground with the junior engineers or senior engineers. And this is how it looks. Go to the next one, please. And showing, so this is another way we've used data. I mean, it's not just to assess what's on the ground, but it's also a great tool for us to use it for community mobilization. So in this particular settlement, we divided the community into groups of about 250 households. And from each of these groups, we trained 1 or 2 volunteers from that community, to use data, to read data. First of all, reading maps, it requires a certain amount of skill. We trained them to use all the IEC material so that they would go to every house within their pocket and make sure that all this, all this training was put to good use. So by the time we left the community, we had an empowered group of young, girls and boys who knew how to read maps, who knew where to go in case there was an issue, because we also linked them up with the urban local body, as we were doing our sanitation programs. And so I think this was very, very important, that we left behind a whole team that would then have the capacities to tackle other issues which came about. The next one, please.
Sorry to interrupt. You have about 90 seconds left.
That's all? Oh my God. Okay, next. The slides need to move a little faster. This is one of the impact slides, all the blue houses becoming pink from 2% to 86%, how the coverage went. Next one. I'll just quickly also go through one of the most exciting things that we are doing is digital addressing. We realized during the pandemic, while we had created all this mapping information and data, which was integrated on GI's platform, tracking and monitoring COVID patients became a huge problem because not everybody can read maps, even in the government. So we started partnering with Google and giving every house a digital address, which was navigable on Google Maps. So today we have a few cities where we've done that. Can we go to the next one, please? Where we've done that for all the slums within a city. I mean, this is what it's an alphanumeric number, which you can, for every house that we've given, which is a locational address based on the latitude and longitude. So it worked both ways. Can we go to the next one, please? It worked both ways. The communities could start leveraging Zomato, Amazon, all the kind of online services, but it came to great use when we had to do the vaccination drive in slum because of the lot of apprehension, myths around vaccination. People were not coming out to get vaccinated. We worked very, very closely with the health departments of Pune, Navi Mumbai, Thane and Kolhapur Municipal Corporation, and ran massive campaigns within slum, not just IAC, but getting them, as somebody rightfully pointed out, people don't know sometimes how to enroll on a COVID app. So registering them on a COVID app and an end-to-end process where we worked with the health department, it was fantastic, the kind of turnout. People got vaccinated. You can see the impact. All those houses in pink have now turned to green because almost everyone in the houses got vaccinated, and those who couldn't come to get vaccinated for whatever reason, we were able to give the house number, the name of the person, and the digital address to the health department so that they could go to every house, to these houses and make sure that they could make that last mile connection. So this is how we used a lot of our data for the vaccination campaign. The next one, I think that should be probably the last slide. Right. So now we are in the on the verge. We've just done an MOU with the Kolhapur Municipal Corporation yesterday. We're going to be integrating a lot of our data and plus code with their water department because they're giving metered water connections, and they want to know what's the outreach of those metered water connection. And so they're going to be using it. So this is the first step towards integrating this data with the urban local bodies platform. The next one. And I see no end to, where it can be used. We did recently a very quick 1 month long program with an NGO which was working in Navi Mumbai gathering waste. Within a month, they found that from just 700 houses that they were covering, they went up to almost 1,800 houses just by planning the routes well, by doing, taking the IC programs directly to the slum dwellers and setting up a whole system, which was only possible because of that data. So a lot of those, pink houses have turned to blue because they're all giving now segregated waste in this particular slum. I think that was probably the last slide, unless there's just something which says thank you at the end of it. So I'll skip this. And I'll just say that, yes, all of our data is on open source platform. All the tools that we use are open source platforms. And I look forward to any further questions that the audience may have.
Thank you, Pratima ji. Really impressive presentation. And I'm not going to eat up any more time of yours. Right at you, I think you may use your presentation from now.
Hi, everybody. Can you see my presentation?
I can.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for this invitation. It's always amazing to be virtually in India and learn from the wonderful things that are happening there. So thank you, Ajay, Utsav, Kanika, for the invitation. So I prepared some slides and I will share some experience that we have in collecting data, national and city scale here in Brazil. So I couldn't avoid to frame it because I think it's very important for you to understand that here in Brazil, we do have a constitution 30 years old. It's the first democratic constitution that really recognizes the right to the city and legitimizes the right of informal dwellers to stay where they are if they are living over 5 years in the same place in unclaimed land. Right, so this is really basic information to what will unfold after '88 when this constitution was approved. So 10 years later, a national law called the City Statute was approved. And this law was very strategic because it enables cities to move forward with land regularization. So it provides tools to really enable the right to the city that was placed in the Constitution. It also enables cities and provides instruments for large-scale upgrading of social and physical infrastructure. And I'm very glad of the way, I was amazed about the way this webinar was organized. So we talked about social infrastructure, we're now talking about physical infrastructure, and the combination of both needs to be upgraded in order to provide full integration of informal settlements in cities. And the third thing that this legislation enables is finance. So land-based mechanisms, but it also authorizes national budget, public budget, local budget to be invested in informal settlements. So it basically, with the Constitution, rights are enabled with this national law that's now 20 years old. Cities, they do have some tools to address the challenges of informal. Practical level, right? At the beginning of the webinar, we were speaking about practical actions. So at the national scale, we improved the census information about informal settlements. And this is very critical because all of you know that our countries are committed to the 2030 agenda, to the SDGs. And we do have the SDG 11. The first target talks about informal settlements. So we need to find ways to address, but we need to measure. If we cannot measure the informal settlements, we will not be able to measure if our countries are achieving the SDG 11 especially. So how can we measure that? The census is a way, but informal settlements are very difficult to measure. So the work that Pratima is doing, that she just presented, is very important to help cities to identify the perimeters of the informal settlements, and also provide cities with additional resources to collect this information and inform the national census. So here in Brazil, the national census is implemented with the help of local governments, of local actors, because we need to apply technologies to map the informal settlements and to map the households, the number of households and the qualities in these informal settlements. So with this information, the country was able to apply investments and grants in large-scale projects in metropolitan areas. So just to mention this big program, the Growth Acceleration Program, PAC Favelas, was implemented in all metropolitan areas in Brazil, over 2,000 settlements. And I'm talking about an investment of around $10 billion in a period of 7 to 10 years, right? Between 2007 and 2014. So these are kind of images of the kind of investments that took place during this period. A total transformation of some settlements. So let's land now in São Paulo. Let's see what happened in São Paulo after this legislation. São Paulo is one case. Different things happened. In the previous slides, I showed pictures from other places in Brazil, but let's see what happened here in São Paulo and how we could also maximize technology to address informal settlements. So in the last 20 years in the city throughout different political terms, and in some cases with support of international organizations, which is the case of the Cities Alliance, the organization I worked for years previously. So in the last 20 years, we have been improving information on informal settlements. So 2003, we basically used aerial pictures. We didn't have satellite images and counting. We used less the type of resources that Pratima was presenting, less co-creation in terms of using the capacity that communities have to collect information. But then in 2006, since 2006, this kind of co-creation and service improved, and also the city started to make use of satellite images. So this project called ABISP basically means a housing information in São Paulo, was co-funded by Cities Alliance, implemented by the city, and mapped through a combination of satellite images and surveys all the informal settlements in the city, including the number of and the features of households, the socio-economic conditions through surveys, but also the physical conditions of households. Later on in 2014, this mapping was incorporated into a citywide integrated information system called GeoSampa. So this GeoSampa system, I'm showing the pictures now, includes information, all information that is available in the city. I'm talking about heritage information. I'm talking about
just a quick
trees,
update on time. You have about 3 minutes.
True, I'm counting.
Yeah.
So, but thank you. So the system was very important, is very important, and was very important for the city to take two main actions. So one was to upgrading formal settlements. With this information, the city was able to localize this national program that I mentioned before. So to have a citywide strategy of upgrading informal settlements and integrating into the city. And here are some pictures of before and after. And then secondly, to mainstream these informal settlements in the urban master plan. So not only looking at the pockets and working at the pockets isolated, but also looking at the city and understanding the role, the functions of these informal settlements, which are very important, you know, in the city. This is one of the maps that for the master plan of 2014, and it shows all the vulnerable settlements, informal settlements in the cities, and this information was very important for the city to identify strategies, urban development strategies to address these vulnerabilities and improve the integration of these settlements in the city. So one of the instruments that was used by the master plan is called the social interest zoning, AZEIS. It is one instrument, one tool that is foreseen by this law, the City Statute. And this zoning, it's a kind of zoning, is very important because it enables cities to, one, fast track regularization processes. Secondly, flexibilize standards, urban standards. So in these areas, the urban standards are flexible. So the building standards are flexible. You can have streets that are not the same as in the formal areas. The buildings, they can have different shapes. So this kind of zoning is very important also to preserve these areas from gentrification, because it kind of regulates the price of the land in these areas. So this is one instrument that is framed by a national legislation and was used at the local level to upgrade these areas, to integrate these areas into the city. And just another example, another city, 700,000 inhabitants, different scale than São Paulo, also incorporated this kind of mapping technology and used that for their risk management policy and the local housing policy, São Bernardo do Campo. So this kind of technology can be used in different scales. A city like São Paulo, 10 million inhabitants, a city like São Bernardo do Campo. And we need this kind of technology and information to really measure, see if we are following with the Agenda 2030, but also to implement action on the ground. Thank you. What's up?
Thank you, Anna. Thanks for the timekeeping. You're kind of making my job easy. So I think I do have a few questions. Since we are running short of time, I'll keep it just to one, and maybe Pratimaji and Anna, you could share the question and see if you have different perspectives on it. You both kind of touched upon the importance of the participatory nature of data collection, how data kind of makes a difference when you use it meaningfully. And Pratimaji did demonstrate what data can do. I mean, in terms of not just providing sanitation services, but going all the way to vaccinating people. So that's how multifarious the data can be. But the question that I have for both of you is that, are cities doing enough to use the data meaningfully in different ways? And are we making it a point where informal settlements and informal individuals or individuals living in informal settlements are gainfully coming into the economy to have a say in who they want to be and what they want to do?
So, Anna, would you like to take it or should I take it?
Go ahead.
Well, as I said, our battle was for 2 decades, but the main battle was to try and get it institutionalized, because cities still are very unwilling to hold any data regarding informal settlements, and that still holds good. In all the 7 cities, the only step that we've been able to, the milestone that we've been able to reach is at least get them to connect their data to what we've sort of publicly published on our website, so that data is in the public domain. But in the sanitation program, we certainly got them to leverage and use this data, but ideally this data needs to be held by them. I have a feeling, in a way, the pandemic has given an impetus to that, because today, especially with the digital addressing, they look more open to integrating that kind of data with their platforms. So I am, pretty hopeful that in the next few years, we might see a few municipalities coming forward and saying, yes, we will own the data, and yes, we will take the responsibility of updating it. because they are beginning to realize that this is the best planning tool that they can, ever hope to have, and which can be leveraged across departments. I mean, we are talking with one of the municipal corporations who are willing to now even support updation of data and integration of that data with their platform. So I'm fairly optimistic that things will start happening, though they are not yet in place.
Thank you, Pratima. Anna, would you like to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I will provide you some data. I just recently, a survey was taken by the national government here, by a national agency. And here in Brazil, we have 5,500 municipalities. Municipalities that are over 20,000 inhabitants, they have to compulsory update their master plan every 10 years, okay? So from these municipalities, over between 20,000 inhabitants and 50,000, 74 have mapped slums and implemented the social interest zoning. The municipalities that are above 50,000 inhabitants, 95% have mapped and zoned. So the mapping and zone took place. Investments are highly dependent from the national government here. This program that I mentioned was very active and put lots of money in slums between 2007 and 2014. Right now, we don't have a national large-scale program, and things with COVID reverted a lot. We don't have data yet, but I'm sure we can see that, right? So we have more people moving from houses to slums because they cannot afford the rents. We have even people moving from slums to streets because they cannot afford to live in slums. And the situation is very visible. So in the case of Brazil, if we don't, really retake the level of investments as we did before, the situation will worsen a lot, I can say. So we managed to institutionalize, but we need to keep going.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Pratima. I think I would probably sort of condense it down to just one word. Equal doesn't always mean equitable. So I think it is important that we understand what data is and what it can do. And cities have to understand its potential faster now than ever before, with COVID striking us without even notice. So thank you again for your presentations. Really appreciate your remarks. Without taking too much time, let me just quickly hop on to the next session, which is on inclusion of persons with disability through accessible ICTs and assistive technologies. And to start us with that session, we have Professor Pvm Rao from IIT Delhi. Professor Rao, thank you again for your patience. You have been here for a while now, so I'll hand it over to you for your presentation now.
Okay. Are my slides visible?
Yes, we can see you and we can also hear you, and the slides are up.
Okay. Good evening, good morning, and thanks for this opportunity. It was really interesting to listen to various speakers and the wonderful work which is happening. Yeah, so I thought I'll use this opportunity basically to highlight some of the challenges people with various disabilities face, particularly in making cities which are inclusive. And since a lot of our work for last 15 years is looking at or building products and solutions for people with visual impairment. So I may be taking examples more from that space, but I think situation is no different with other disabilities as well. Okay, so I think when we are speaking about inclusive cities, still I think the challenges are too many for people with various disabilities. And this is even more annoying in the sense that if you really look at the digital technology, there has been an explosion, and digital technologies are now easily available, affordable. but still the benefits of that largely are yet to reach when it comes to people with disabilities. Okay, so one thing which we have seen that is particularly working with a lot of people over last 10, 12, 15 years, we have also seen life changing for some of the people who came to cities, particularly when they did not have an employment. The families considered them as economically dependent, but I think the employment made a big change, and then probably it led to more of an economic prosperity. But when we speak about an employment, there are still major challenges. So for any employment, education is a precursor, and for education, mobility is a precursor. So I think this trio of mobility, education, employment is something which probably inclusive cities still have to work in multiple cases so that the benefits can reach. I'll just give a couple of examples and probably cases which will highlight these things. Now, when I probably look at employment, we have seen people with disabilities taking two types of, you can say, organizations where they're employed. One is government, because there is an affirmative action. So you have certain reservations and when you are employed, but the real benefits did not accrue because many of the organizations we have seen that though they have employed, but I think they have not fully leveraged on the capabilities which these people can offer. Whereas when we look at the other category, a lot of people, particularly with visual disabilities, were employed in recent times with many organizations in information technology, and they were immensely benefited. And I think the investment, the provisions which these companies made in order to employ were very happy, particularly because they have seen that given the right training, the kind of output and efficiency which these people bring in is in no way comparable to any of the other normal people. And second thing is, many of the companies found that the attrition rates are extremely low, is another big advantage which they found in employing. So from the employment perspective, I think we still have to do a lot, both when they're employed with federal organizations and particularly and also with the private organization. There is a huge opportunity, and I think we haven't still leveraged on that particular aspect. Education is probably a much bigger challenge. If you really look at, again, coming back, looking from the visual impairment and visual disability perspective, there is a huge gap in particularly education being inclusive. In fact, I would say schools have done better than the higher education. When it comes to higher education, the challenges are even more. But I think the higher education is very important from the employability perspective. If you really look at universities and institutes across the country, it's still very difficult to find, let's say, one institute which has done remarkably well in particularly empowering people with disabilities in terms of higher education. And I think that's a very, very big challenge. And whether it's an admission process or whether it's attending the classes or whether it's examination process, the challenges are still many. Take, for example, a person with visual impairment who goes for, let's say, a university education and is not able to access, let's say, a pictorial content. Let's say you want to study math, science, economics, or maybe even geography or history. the pictorial content becomes extremely, and we still do not have really many of the universities or colleges which can provide that. So those are really challenges. And I think in spite of all the developments which are happening in assistive technologies, these challenges still needs to be addressed. And the mobility challenges are also pretty serious. Now, when I say mobility, I'm looking at from the inclusive cities perspective, 3 aspects. Outdoor mobility is one, and accessing, let's say, the public transport. And
Professor, I'll just say a quick update on the time. You have about 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. And is a wayfinding in a indoor navigation, let's say a big building or a mall is an issue. So all the 3 mobility challenges still remain largely. And I think there is a lot of digital technologies which can help, though some new innovations are happening, but I think it's still, I think I would say there is still a huge gap between what is possible and the benefits which have reached the people. When it comes to assistive technologies, which can actually make cities really inclusive, we often, I think this was also mentioned by Veronica, that we often look at very traditional assistive technologies, like the one, maybe a white cane or a wheelchair or a hearing aid. But if you really look at the explosion in digital technologies, there is much more which are possible. Just to give an example, for example, let's look at an Alexa. Alexa actually can do maybe a dozens of things to empower people with disabilities, which has still not been explored. I think I have not seen many people using, let's say, people with visual impairment, using Alexa to, let's say, for the home automation purpose, whether I want to use a microwave or a washing machine or an air conditioner controls, people still struggle, depend on the sighted assistance, whereas a device such as this can actually do that. So when we say inclusive cities, these are the things where technologies are available, but the benefits are still not reaching. In some cases, it's possible. For example, this is an example of a Samurai, which is a speech therapy app. Since there is not much of physical infrastructure which is involved, people are able to reach 100,000 people in 150 countries in a very short time. But again, there is a much more scope when it comes to these.
There are 30 seconds.
Yeah. The third aspect which we looked at is key. When we build use the digital technologies, it's very important to be more universal in nature. Often the apps which are built specifically for a disability have work less, and I think the universality has helped people to take it. Just to give an example, most of the popular apps which we use are still do not give the same usability and user experience for the people. And this is one of my probably last slides. We were also doing a project where the students were actually working for building a gaming console for elderly. And I think what we realized is the student and the team was always looking at the functionality of a gaming console. But I think when they built and gave one, the people were very happy. People were very happy for very different reasons. So one of the elderly persons whom the student met said, I'm happy not because it actually works very well. I'm happy because my grandson now comes more often to me than previously. And this is last. This is a challenge which probably inclusive cities has to address. Wherever assistive technologies can be individually accessed by the people, there has been some reach. Wherever you have a system level technologies, let's say making a public transport accessible or a building accessible, there have been challenges because this is not something where individuals can buy. So hence, I think we have still many things to do and many miles to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Can I quickly call upon Dr. Khasnadis for his presentation, please?
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. It's a real pleasure to speak. And though I have been asked how to include people with disabilities, but I added, as Veronica started her session, two things more. One is older people, and another is the environment. Because whatever we do, whether digital technology, assistive technology, but if the environment is not accessible. So can we go to the next, please? Next slide. Yeah, so that's what I added, enabling environment, because that's a very key issue of the urban planning. Next. Next. So why I have added older people? Need and benefit are much more than what we perceive and believe. And if we add persons with disabilities, because in India they're very underestimated, it's only 2% population. So really majority doesn't care, or the policymakers do not care more about this 2% population. But if we add also older people, then we are actually talking about 25 to 30% of the population. And we strongly believe what is good for persons with disabilities is equally good for older people, and in fact, good for the whole population. It is not about the inclusion of only persons with disabilities and older people. In fact, it is about all of us. All of us will benefit if we have an inclusive urban development. Next. So why low rates of innovation despite of this huge emerging need? Why? Its main is the awareness. Awareness is low at every level. Perception is benefiting a few, 1 to 2% of the disabled people, not the majority. Another biggest problem what we see is a mindset. It's a very pro-poor, charity and feel-good approach. And the leadership is political will, not enough, going beyond comfort zone, succeeding in competing agendas, lack of long-term thinking of planning, and not understanding the market. The whole issue is still very much charity or social good driven rather than the market science. Next. And this is a classic example that opening and nurturing the market. In 1958, and almost at the same time, India started Hindustan Motors ambassador, and Japan started Toyota. And you see where they are today. So we have to really look more in a different perspective than what is our common perception. Next. So when I say assistive technology, we say everything from a simple glasses walker up to the robotics. All this has potential, not only disabled people, not only older people or people living with health condition. In fact, it has the potential to benefit everybody. Next. But recently, we published a global report on assistive technology, and where we have found there's a big gap. Most programs are not very people-centered, especially pro-poor centered, and there's a gap between policy, products, provision, and personnel. So ecosystem is not working together, and as a result, next. So as I said, need is much more than what we think, 2.5 billion today, 3.5 billion by 2050. And as you see that 2 in 3 people aged over 60 need at least one assistive products. So the need is increasing very rapidly. And as older population is increasing in India, we have to really make sure that everything we do is disabled and age-friendly. Next. But there is a big problem between there's a great inequity in terms of access to technology and the environmental products. Inequity ranges from as low as 2% to as high as 84%. There's a big gap between the North and the South. And this is where I think the greatest challenge lies. But the good thing is also, if we see in the other way, it gives a tremendous potential for business growth or further development. Next. So it's a time for paradigm shift. We have to go from charity to human rights, universal access. You have to understand beyond disability and traditional assistive products like wheelchair or tricycle or cane. Opening and enabling the market. Startups, we are having a lot of startup, but startup has to come to the market and then to the global market. Export. The export market of assistive technology from India is very poor, which needs a lot of nurturing. And emergence of digital technology, especially in creating new opportunities, I strongly say, embrace it so we can go for digital assistive technology. Digital platform can help us to reach more people at a quicker time. Next. So if you ask how to promote AT business in India, India knows how to do it. India has done it well in medicine, vaccines, medical tech devices, biotech, ICT. So India has the knowledge, India has the capacity. It's a time for AT. And the one is that you have to mainstream AT within the Make in India campaign, Skills India campaign, Invest India, or Atmanirbhar Bharat. And that's the way forward. Next. But as I said, without inclusive environment and infrastructure, the environment needs a lot of work in India, because without that, we have a very little progress. And we say that we are looking for an environment where everyone can live independently, easily, and dignity, regardless of disability, age, and health conditions. We look for more lifetime home and neighborhood. It should not be such as you get older, you change from house to rural to urban, urban to rural, or house to apartment, or ultimately old age home. Inclusion.
Dr. Khasnavis, do we still have you with us?
Next.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, can you go next? Quick. I just want to say, it looks like, if you look at the East London before Olympics and after Olympics, there's so much change because they have their inclusive urban planning. And next slide. And as a result, everything changed. Everybody gained. This is what East London was before Olympics. And this is what East London today. And we said economic gain everywhere. Everybody benefits if we make it inclusive for all. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khasnavis. Thank you again. I mean, it's always a pleasure listening to you speak, and your presentations are always, as always, very succinct. Dr. Khasnavis, I think you have perfectly given a segue for us to invite Dr. Hajaz to talk about his efforts at GDI Hub. You talked about the London Olympics, and I think GDI Hub was one of the pioneering institutions there. So Dr. Hajaz, I'm not going to take any more time of yours, so over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And just to confirm, can you see me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can see you, we can hear you well, and your presentations are up on the screen.
Lovely, thank you. And greetings to everybody in the audience. And this was a beautiful transition with the London Olympics. We are very excited at the GDI hub to actually move at the east part of the London in the next few months. And I have to say, when I've seen the agenda, I saw that Professor Rao and Chapal will be speaking just before me, and I thought, oh, you know, it's very difficult to say anything new after such excellent speakers and well-established people in the area. So I thought I'll take the approach where I would really just like to a little bit complement what's been said so far and give some examples. And I thought I will contribute to today's discussion through three angles. One, through my personal or lived experience as a blind individual to some of the challenges that, for example, Professor Rao mentioned around mobility, employment, and education, but also to give an example through some of the innovators that we worked with in India, through GDI Hub's programs. And at the end, I would like to just very briefly say a few words about what GDI Hub is doing to help the whole ecosystem to grow. So very first, I don't have any slides on this, but I was born completely sighted. And then around the age of 6, my sight deteriorated. So I lived the next 10 years as a partially sighted person. So I relied a lot on special notebooks, thicker pens, digital magnifiers to help me do my education. And towards the end of high school, I completely lost my sight. I became blind, which meant that all the assistive technology I used so far, I essentially had to give away and learn new ones, which are very different. For example, text-to-speech and screen reader technologies, get some training and so on. And I also faced an interesting challenge, whether I wanted to study something more text-based, like maybe psychology or history, which I knew from my 1 to 2 years of experience that is fairly doable with the technologies I've been shown. But then my passion was really to study sciences and technology. I wanted to become a theoretical physicist, but that seemed to be a lot more challenging with all the equations and graphs, which at the time were very poorly accessible, even in Hungary, where I was born. But I wanted to take the challenge, so I did. And I learned quickly that there are a lot more less known assistive solutions and innovations out there. I relied a lot on the open source community to hack essentially into some of the existing assistive technologies, the softwares, to make it more personalized and meet the needs I had with science. And I really feel that I made the right choice by following my passion to take up the challenge, because studying physics enabled me to study programming, to carry on with my PhD studies in computer science, and eventually become part of the GDI Hub team. So that's just a bit of a preface of me, but I would like to first of all talk about a case study or an example on my second slide, and that's to do with Trestle Labs. And Trestle Labs was founded by a person called Bonnie Dave back in 2017, and they are based in India. And they've been through one of our 80 Accelerator programs that I will talk about a little bit later. And now today, just 4 or 5 years later, before they joined our startup Accelerator, they now help more than 65,000 people through their products for vision impaired people, mostly to get access to education, but also to other non-education related things, to generally speaking, just access information and be part of the classroom, be part of the household, and also to make a more inclusive product by not just offering this to blind and low vision users, but also to people with dyslexia and other disabilities. So why did Trestle Lab come up with the products and ideas, that the innovations they wanted to push forward? Well, that's because in India alone, there are many millions of children between the age of 5 and 18, that the sort of typical school age, who need access to handwritten materials, sometimes to get access to textbook. And because Braille literacy is very low in many parts of the world, not to mention the available amount of and quality of Braille resources. So that's the problem and the challenge they identified, or Bonnie Dave identified with Tresor Labs. So on my next slide of the solution, I'd like to highlight just a few things. I realize there's lots of text to read, but I'm more than happy to share the slides with anybody who would like to study it in more details. But coming back to the solution, what Tresor Labs has achieved is quite a few things. First of all, they introduced a product line called the Kibo products, which includes a mobile application for smartphones, a desktop or web application, and also an actual physical device to scan in documents and process this further. So one way to process this is really to digitize handwritten text into an electronic format, but also to translate this to local languages. And here I would like to highlight two points, which is the reason why I chose to talk about Tresor Labs as an example. And that's because they realized through their business development that, you know, even though they started out as a company to help blind and partially sighted students or learners at schools, they managed to scale up a lot more when they offered the services in terms of translating to local languages. I believe they now offer more than 60 local languages. And I think this is really important because in the global north, there are solutions similar to what Tresor Labs developed. If you just think about Microsoft seeing AI and many other services which do similar things, but of course they are designed in a way that only the most prominent languages, European and sort of American languages are available. So here, what Tresor Labs has achieved is really to bring the same solution or similar solution to the local community by means of other languages. But the other thing is that really, even though they started to develop an assistive technology, it very quickly became an inclusive ICT solution and innovation, because now the majority of customers use this to simply digitize text, to read it out loud if they have difficulties with reading. And I think it's just a really nice example of how assistive technology innovation can grow beyond its initial scope. As Chapal was saying, we can help elderly people and many other audiences. But I would now like to move on to my sort of third section of my discussion, which is to talk a little bit about Innovate Now. And Innovate Now is one of GDI Hub's programs. It's an AT, Assistive Technology Accelerator, that we started running in Kenya back in 2019. And we are very much hoping that from that pilot study or case study, we will be able to expand this to other parts of the world, like India and Europe, for example, in East London. And Innovate Now has been running for 5 cohorts of early stage startup ventures, founders who are really trying to tackle the assistive technology innovation challenges, both mobility, education, and employment. So some of the services that Innovate Now is offering is something that we learned in the last 5 years through all the GDI Hub programs. We realized that to be able to put 100 assistive products to the market, we needed 1,000 ideas. So we started working on the Spark innovation branch of our innovation programs. But in order to scale those 100 ideas or products and really make a large impact in the world, we also need a startup accelerator and other initiatives. So through our Innovate Now program, we offer a mentor and investor network. We help the founders to really become part of an ecosystem and strengthen that whole ecosystem of mentoring and investment. But not only that, we also realize that sometimes founders think that they understand the problem, either because they themselves experience a problem, but as I'm sure most of you know, one one person with a disability doesn't mean that the other person with a disability will have the same experience. So that's where we came up with the concept of Live Lab, which is essentially an intense 6 weeks period where we make sure that startups.
Dr. Hajaz, just a quick time check. You have about 50 seconds left.
All right, thank you. So yeah, as I was saying, the early stage founders and startups have a chance to meet people with disabilities and make sure that they solve the problems that are really identified by the people we are trying to help. So I already, in my next slide on the achievements, I already talked a little bit about all the achievements that Innovate Now has, many ventures and many more that we plan to support. And on my second to last slide, I would just like to reference GDI Hub Accelerate, which is our innovation arm, where we essentially have the startup accelerator, some scale studios to coach ready to scale businesses and give an aftercare of support beyond all the services I mentioned before, and hope that from the initial 1,000 ideas, innovative ideas, through 100 early stage startups, we can successfully put 10 scalable products to the market, for example, Tresor Labs. So I'll conclude on that. Thank you very much. But you'll see my email address. Please do reach out. And again, thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Dr. Hajaz. That was an excellent presentation. I think Dr. Khasnavas has left, but we do have Professor Rao and Dr. Hajaz with us. So I'll just have one question since we're running short of time, and a question that is pertinent to now. I think globally, if you look at the number of startups and the number of unicorns that are coming through every year with big investments happening, and tech is one of those driving factors. But there are very, very narrow number of startups and product solutions that are catered towards assistive technology, which means there are some intrinsic demand and supply issues, and there are also barriers to entry probably in the sector at large. So if you could just quickly take maybe about 60 seconds to answer each on what can be done from an ecosystem perspective to ease the businesses and solutions to come into it, and also thinkers and ideators to be part of the process.
Yeah. So is this for me?
Yes, it is for both of you. I mean, you can take a step at it.
Okay, maybe I can go first and then Daniel can come next.
Sure.
So I think it's still a challenge. If you really look at the AT market, as Chapal mentioned, if you purely look from the disability perspective, the market is pretty small. So I think going ahead, if you really want to, and when you look at, you mentioned about unicorns. So unicorns can happen even if you have value addition, which happens just in one aspect, whether it's technological or sociological or even a business model. But I think when it comes to AT, you need to address all of them. You can't probably leave any one of them. But just going ahead, I think there can be 3 ways to probably look at. One way is instead of looking at a local market, if we look at a global market, and if the product development can happen more from the global perspective, expanding the market would be one. Second is, as Daniel also mentioned, instead of looking at assistive technologies which are exclusive, if they can be made more universal where everybody and anybody can use. For example, the wonderful example is a mobile. Mobile is the best assistive technology, but I think is used by everyone. Could be another approach. And the third is, I think somewhere government also has to play a role. Now, many of the manufacturers do not come because initial investment, particularly to make it market ready, is people think that it's viable. If government can actually take care of, let's say, the development cost of an assistive technology through fund, then probably a lot of subsidy. It's like giving an indirect subsidy to manufacturer to do that. We were able to take 2 of the assistive technologies to market a large number of people because a charity came and probably took care of the entire development cost.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Dr. Hajaz, your thoughts, please.
Sure, I'll just give a very brief comment on that. So I think, first of all, maybe just to reiterate the way I see the problem and then what potentially can be the solution or some way around the solution. So I think when we talk about assistive technology and especially talking to investors, assistive technology is a bit too broad and too narrow at the same time. So even though we often mention, as Chapal was saying, potentially 3.5 billion people, you would think that for assistive technology, that's a huge market, almost, a third to a half of the global population. But then when you take the other side of the coin, it's equally very narrow because, for example, some of the products that we or innovators that we support through Innovate Now, let's say develop a new, very, very essential piece of assistive technology, for example, a new wheelchair design or mobility scooter, which is suitable for some rural terrain in Kenya, maybe relevant to the local terrain, the local climate and the customs and so on. But this can be a very, very narrow market. And we sometimes confuse, we refer to it as an assistive technology, which kind of implies something that will be used by 3 billion people. But then when we, in the same sentence, mention the very specific product, that might be only something that 100 people use. So again, one solution around this is, as already Professor Rao mentioned, the inclusivity part of it. But the other is also to somehow come up with a new mindset where we bring this broad and narrow interpretation of assistive technology into some sort of a common denominator. And then hopefully maybe investors will be more keen to invest and it will improve the whole market dynamics. How we do that, there's a few potential ways. For example, what we see with funds having different portfolios of companies. So there's not a choice. There's a whole spectrum of assistive technologies that get invested in and scaled. But I think we are yet to figure out the sort of proper solution around some of these challenges.
Thank you, Dr. Hajaz. I think that's really well said. I think broad and narrow at the same time. It's like a paradox, but that's exactly what it is. I think inclusion in any form is like a paradox. We all want to have an antidote to all kinds of discrimination happening, social, spatial, whatever the case might be. But technology, in fact, one of our experts at one point in time said that the technology that he uses is a frenemy. So it's a friend and enemy at the same time for persons with disabilities. So I think the onus is on us to create more inclusively and to use data and more participatory approaches as we go forward. That being said, thank you so very much, Professor Rao and Dr. Hajaz. Those are really stellar presentations and for summarizing the thoughts so beautifully. I'm not going to take any more time, and thank you again for everyone in the audience for being so patient. I think we have overrun our time. So I'll quickly hand it over to Shivangi to sort of call upon Ajay for the vote of thanks and for the quick summarization.
Thank you, Utsav, and all our wonderful panelists for such productive and insightful discussions. As we near the end of today's webinar, I would like to invite Mr. Ajay Suri to summarize the key takeaway from today's discussions and wrap it up with a vote of thanks. Over to you, Mr. Suri.
Thanks, Shiva. Well, I will not even try and summarize because it's been such a wide spectrum of thoughts being shared on the use of digital technology, inclusion of families, informal sector workers, and persons with disabilities. Well, I think the director had set the ball rolling, whereby he threw a challenge at us, saying that, can we come up with an action plan which can help the commissioners or the chief executive officers of urban local bodies to promote inclusive development? And the discussions today definitely are the building blocks for preparing this action plan. Shalini had highlighted the high percentage of the Indian labor force employed in the informal sector, and the long-standing challenges of the informal sector workers, which all of us are aware of, has been the poor work environment, poor access to development inputs, and lack of social security and nets. Having said, I think this has changed drastically over the past few years by financial inclusion of informal workers is being promoted and they are being provided access to capacity building inputs and technology under the MSME programs. Uh, and also the online aggregator services has helped not only for food as is demonstrated by Zomato, but also items including cabs, auto rickshaws, e-cars, urban services that we need every day on a day-to-day basis, handicrafts, so on and so forth. Definitely digital technology or the online aggregator services can integrating informal sector workers and enterprises with city economy, meaning expansion in business for the informal sector workers. But I think there are dual challenges to achieving this mission and goal. One is to build the capacity of the informal units and work to compete with the formal businesses by adopting the sector protocols, and also to build the capacity to use digital technology to promote digital literacy, to say. Uh, and my next comment is not for Zomato, but in general, I think there is a strong need for regulatory framework to provide the workers or the informal sector workers with social security and safety nets, and also to control the extortionist approaches of aggregator services. And if you're not able to regulate, it may result in fall in income rather than a rise in income of the informal sector workers. Pratima and Anna brought out remarkably well the use of open data technology for improving the informal settler families' access to urban service and for their access to livable housing as well. I think city database, both on informal sector workers as well as informal settler families, would help to integrate one informal sector rehabilitation or upgrading in the city development plans and integrating formal sector in local economic development plans as well. Technology, as was brought out, can be used to strengthen the capacities of the informal settler families or communities, negotiate with the service provider, improvement in access to services as well. But to my mind, data can also be a double-edged sword. Uh, unless and until there is ample advocacy in favor of looking at slums as future suburbs and informal sector as important contributors to the economy, uh, just developing a base could have adverse impacts. Two examples, without naming the cities. Uh, we were working in one of the Southeastern cities to help them to develop, to map the informal settlements and also to develop a database which could be used for slum reading. While this effort was on in with the co-ownership of the city agencies and the slum communities, the chief minister of the region came up with statements in support of forcible eviction and forcible relocation, which became a huge reputational risk for us because we were seen as collaborators to this forcible eviction. And we had to step in and we had to bring in all the international brains in business to advocate for in situ slum upgrading rather than evictions and resettlements. Uh, Another example is from an Indian city where under the National Urban Livelihood Missions, we were supporting the city to map the street vendors in city. And when we made a presentation to the divisional commissioner and the district magistrate, they immediately said, what are the vendors doing here? They need not be here and need to be removed. I thought these exercises became counterproductive, that they were not in fact contributing to improving the quality of life and the productivity of workers, but became a threat to their existence itself. Lastly, uh, our Prime Minister had made a call, a medium-term aim at transitioning from to a $5 trillion economy. And the idea was we move from $3 trillion at present to $5 trillion in a couple of years. Now, if we are to achieve this mission, we need all hands on deck, and assistive technology would help to improve the participation of persons with disability in the urban workforce. And I think that would help achieve the objective of moving from economic dependence to economic prosperity. It is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the Inclusive City Center. Firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Hitesh, Director, NIUA, not only for his opening address, but also for the continuous support and encouragement that we receive from him. He keeps throwing challenges at us, and we try and respond to the challenges in the most constructive way. Our thanks to the panelists, Neha, Shalini, Pratima, Anna, Kapil, and Daniel, for accepting our invite and for the insightful presentations during the webinar today. My special thanks to my colleagues, Veronica for setting the context, Kanika for the welcome address, Shivangi for being the MC, and Utsav for moderating the discussions with the panelists itself. Thanks also to Manisha and Atul for sign language interpretation, and to all the participants for joining the call. Last, my personal thanks to the young but talented ICT team for organizing the webinar today, and also the hard work over the past 1 year, much beyond their job description in terms of reference, which has got the ICC a lot of visibility amongst the urban stakeholders. And the center is seen as one which is focusing on the intersectionality of the marginalized communities. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in the next edition of the webinar. Over to you, Shivangi.
Thank you, Mr. Suri, and for summarizing all of what was said today in a very brief understanding of what we want to do ahead. I would bring the webinar to end with this. Thank you to all our panelists and attendees.